This week, we are putting the Northern Gateway Pipeline in focus. Last night and Monday night, we aired our interview with John Carruthers, the president of Northern Gateway Pipelines. Joining us now for more perspective on that potential pipeline is Thomas Isaac in Vancouver. Thomas is a lawyer, and he's the head of the National Aboriginal Law Group with the firm McCarthy and Tetro. And joining us from Ottawa is Clayton Thomas-Muller. Clayton is a co-director of the Indigenous Tar Sands campaign of the Polaris Institute. Thank you very much for being here, the both of you. I'd like to begin by showing a clip from our interview with the president of Northern Gateway Pipelines, and then we'll talk more about it. Here's John Carruthers on the equity deals signed by First Nations.
Well, we've offered to our closest neighbors, and those are within the engagement zone, which was 80 kilometers on either side of the pipeline right-of-way, so very wide perspective. We invited most of those First Nations to join with us in being partners over the long term so that they would see long-term economic benefits, and that's where we offered equity to some 45 communities. And as I mentioned, 26 of those communities have signed on to be equity partners. Now, that doesn't mean they could still have concerns from an environmental perspective, and they could still raise those concerns with the joint review panel. But I think it fundamentally shows that they would be long-term partners with us, or something that they would work with us over the long term if we address the issue. So I would see that as indicative of support. It doesn't mean that it's full support in all aspects. So that's it. And then with the others that didn't sign on, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't support, but again, I would think if you did, that would be a good indication. So they would still have concerns that we need to address.
Now, Thomas, 26 First Nations so far have agreed to be long-term partners with Enbridge in the Northern Gateway Pipeline project. Explain for us what these long-term equity deals typically mean when a First Nation agrees to sign them.
Well, I mean, typically, you know, without focusing on the specifics around the Enbridge deal, but typically what those agreements allow for is a long-term revenue stream to First Nations based on their equity participation in a project. They can also mean sharing some of the risk as well. So in terms of needs for cash calls and related liabilities, that can also go along with ownership. So it's one model of flowing benefits to First Nations.
Is an equity deal acknowledgement of an existing Indigenous right for a share of resource revenue?
Well, I think, you know, from my own experience across the country on these matters, is that it really does depend on the First Nation and the company. I would say typically not. These deals tend to be business focused. I mean, this is typically after environmental concerns have been dealt with, or environmental concerns are being dealt with in another forum. So to be absolutely clear, no one's suggesting environmental concerns or Aboriginal rights or treaty rights concerns aren't being dealt with. But usually when you get into the equity aspect of a deal, we're really talking about a business structure that allows for revenue to flow to owners.
Now, Clayton, as Tom just talked about, signing up to be a partner with Enbridge does come with some risk and responsibility. What's your understanding of what kind of liability the First Nation would then be taking on by signing the equity deal?
Well, I think, you know, risk is the underlying word here. You know, I think that when we look at the over 140 First Nations that have signed the Save the Fraser River Declaration, the tens of thousands of British Columbians who are opposed to the Enbridge Northern Gateway proposal, you know, the dozens of First Nations communities impacted by the expansion of the controversial Canadian tar sands, coastal residents here in Canada Canada concerned about an Exxon Valdez or Gulf of Mexico disaster-style spill in the Pacific Northwest coast. Risk is definitely what we're talking about. And when we look at the numbers that the president of Enbridge has put out in terms of 23 out of 45 right-of-way impacted First Nations signing on to their deal, well, you know, I question whether or not that is actually buy-in or what is Enbridge's interpretation of sign-on. When we look at the Gitga'at representative who signed on to Enbridge and the fact that, you know, he did not consult with the hereditary leadership in Gitga'at territory in and around the Hazelton area in northern BC on the right-of-way of the pipeline, I significantly question and doubt the integrity of Enbridge, you know, and their PR machinery moving forward in terms of having some kind of valid consultation or any respect for the free, prior, and informed consent. In other words, the right to say no of First Nations that are concerned about the impacts of Enbridge, particularly on their salmon-based economy.
Yeah, talking with John Carruthers, he did mention if they sign an equity deal, he figures that's confirmation that they are agreeing to the project and being long-term partners, even though they may have concerns in the deal. And just for clarity's sake, John Carruthers is the president of Northern Gateway Pipelines, not Enbridge, just so we're crystal clear on that. Now, Tom, John Carruthers talked about the biggest decision coming from the Joint Review Panel about whether Northern Gateway is in the public interest. What factors go into determining what is the public interest in this case?
Well, I mean, again, typically these panels will have to balance a wide array of interests, and some of those interests will be competing interests. The need for continuing to promote the development of the oil sands and the arguments in favor of that, of being able to export our product out of the country. That'll be an issue that needs to be considered. Additionally, environmental concerns, environmental mitigation will obviously be an important matter, as will First Nations concerns. And these things ultimately should be fully, and I think we've got ample evidence that the panel's doing a very thorough job of hearing all of these concerns, and ultimately they'll have to weigh all the evidence that's put in front of them and make a recommendation. You know, I do note that in terms of these deals at the end of the day, they involve democratically elected leaders in terms of First Nations that are signing on. The development of the oil sands has involved many First Nations that have supported it. It's also had some First Nations that oppose these developments, and that's what happens in a free democracy, and that's what ultimately at the end of the day that I think that we should be looking for, is ensuring that our processes are fair.
Yes, certainly I guess money would be a part of that determination. John Carruthers talked about losing multiple billions of dollars if this pipeline doesn't go through. Clayton, this may come down to a big showdown if the Joint Review Panel approves the pipeline. Where do you think Enbridge will encounter its most fierce opposition?
Well, first of all, you know, with all due respect to Tom from Vancouver, I mean, he's no stranger to the complexities of the First Nations political landscape in British Columbia with his history with the BC Treaties Commission. In British Columbia, there is multiple political entities, including the inherent chiefs, which are not necessarily the same bodies as the Department of Indian Affairs or Indian Act Chief and Councils. There are many different tensions that exist within First Nations in British Columbia that need to be considered. And when you talk about democracy, you have to talk about sovereignty. And there is no pan-Aboriginal formula that Enbridge or any other extractive industries or energy transport company or the federal government of Canada can utilize to try and silo up First Nations into one group. You know, the reality of it is that there is a unbreakable wall of First Nations represented by the signatories of Save the Fraser River Declaration and also other grassroots entities like the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, who have built permanent infrastructure on the proposed right-of-way of the Northern Gateway pipeline and other controversial pipelines that are the industry is trying to build through their territories. So the showdown, you know, fundamentally is going to come down to whether or not Harper listens to the National Energy Board Joint Review Panel recommendations next year, or whether or not the PMO, with their new totalitarian-style power over policies and decision-making over whether or not this is in the national interest, will just try and railroad the project ahead anyway, regardless of the voices of thousands and thousands of people who have brought their concerns forward to the JRP over the last little while, and that will continue to do so.
Yeah, you talked about 30,000 pages of evidence that the Joint Review Panel is going over. Some of those concerns, a lot of those concerns who are against, without a doubt, they're worried about oil spills, and it's a huge concern. Let's talk about the safety of the pipelines. But first I want to show you another clip from John Carruthers about Enbridge's safety record with pipelines.
Enbridge, Northern Gateway at some point would expect that Enbridge would build and operate the project. And if you look at Enbridge's environmental record in comparison to industry, it's very good. In terms of historically, Enbridge would have had less than half the number of incidents per volume per mile moved, and the only one we had a very significant, our largest in our history in terms of the spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And again, that's made us refocus and get back to, with that, then the spill volumes that we had were about industry average, but clearly our historical record is better than industry average, significantly better, and we've had the one incident. But we've taken a lot of learning from that about what went wrong in that incident and what we have to do to avoid another such incident. So Enbridge itself has a very strong record from an environmental operational perspective.
Clayton, what do you make of John Carruthers' statement that Enbridge's safety record is significantly better than industry average?
Well, first of all, John Carruthers saying that Enbridge's spill record or incident record is better than industry average is like ExxonMobil getting up and saying, hey, the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska is way less worse than BP's oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, come on, give me a break. The reality of it is that when your bottom line is profit for shareholders living thousands of miles away from externalized costs like oil spills, which local communities end up paying the price for, not only for cleanup, but also economically in terms of, you know, having fragile salmon-based economies destroyed forever by potential oil spills by this pipeline, which will happen. And the industry track record right across the board shows that no matter what, there are spills. Enbridge just had a spill in the sovereign Red Lake Ojibwe Nation in northern Minnesota. They spent over $1 billion on the controversial Kalamazoo River spill, and it's still not cleaned up, because I'll tell you why. When tar sands spills out of a ruptured pipeline, and the condensate that they mix tar sands with, which is hard as a hockey puck, okay? This stuff is, they mine this stuff out of the earth, and they have to mix it with corrosive solvents to make it run through a pipeline. When this stuff ruptures out of a pipeline or out of the hull of a super tanker that they want to bring into Gitga'at, Canada's most dangerous waters on record in federal documentation, this stuff, once the condensate evaporates, actually sinks to the bottom. It doesn't float on the top like your conventional light sweet crude oil. And when it's flowing through a pipeline, not only do they superheat it, which changes the conditions of pipeline erosion, but it's tar sands, so it's filled with sand and quartz, and this stuff is super corrosive on the inside of pipes. And so the imminent threat of spills in salmon-producing rivers and streams all along the right-of-way of the Northern Gateway, the imminent threat of supertankers creating another Exxon Valdez-like disaster in the Pacific Northwest, this stuff is not a question of if it's going to happen, but more a question of when it's going to happen.
The Joint Review Panel is taking this environmental concerns into account. Is there a threshold of an acceptable risk of spills when it comes to projects like Northern Gateway?
Well, look, I mean, on any projects, I mean, whether you're in the mining sector, whether you're in the oil sector, in the energy production sectors or delivery sectors generally, there are risks, and the issue is have you done what is reasonable to mitigate against those potential risks? In terms of the evidence that the JRP has seen and in terms of what Enbridge has done, there's no doubt that Enbridge has put together plans and has responded to the very criticisms that have been brought forward to mitigate and go beyond what are minimum standards. The bigger issue from so I think that is clear and it's on the evidence, and again that will have to be weighed. But the bigger issue too is that while there's opposition to the project, all of these things, there is an element of gray here, and the element of gray is that while there are some communities concerned about it, some communities are deriving their livelihood from these, including First Nations in Alberta. And again, and likewise across the country, whether it's mining projects or what have you. And all my point is that these projects, until we move to some other form of economy, the wage economy right now demands, and to pay for health care, to pay for education, demands development. And I think the challenge for our governments and for, I guess, all of us as Canadians is to ensure that we're taking the appropriate degree of risk mitigation and management on all of these projects or endeavors, because that's right now currently how our economy operates, and that's what pays the bills, not only for non-Aboriginal people but for Aboriginal peoples as well.
Definitely lots of huge decisions that will be made over this next less than a year. We'll have to leave our discussion at that. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us. Thomas Isaac in Vancouver and Clayton Thomas-Muller in Ottawa. Thank you both.
Thank you
so much for having us, and happy May Day to everybody watching.